We are very glad to be discussing Trump Unleashed, essentially the impact of the new Trump administration as seen by our speaker today. I would like to just start by saying that it's almost impossible to ignore the fact of the Donald Trump II administration, which started in January 2020. Almost every single day, we have seen these executive orders and actions that have essentially upended the world as we knew it. In fact, some people are beginning to talk of a new world order. The impact has been heavy across the world, but more so on the African continent with the discontinuation of US aid, the ending of funding for health and climate related programs, and trade more broadly. In Africa, South Africa has been very clearly a major target of the Trump II administration and its withdrawal from global compacts, global governance systems, and tending towards more of isolationists. My role is very simple today, is to introduce our speaker. Those of you who have watched CNN for years might be well familiar with the name Robyn Curnow. We are very glad to have her today to help us unpack the new foreign policy of the United States. Robyn is an award-winning anchor, foreign correspondent, and sought-after public speaker. She's the founder and runs Searching for America podcasts, and we encourage you to look it up. I'll repeat, the podcast is called Searching for America. She previously spent over 2 decades at the CNN, anchoring shows on both CNN USA, CNN International. She has served as correspondent in Johannesburg and the London Bureau covering Europe. Amongst the people that Robyn has covered or interviewed include Nelson Mandela, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, President Jimmy Carter, who passed on only a few months ago, Bill Clinton, George Bush, Michelle Obama. She has covered major events, including US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, the coup in Myanmar a couple of years back, and the death of Fidel Castro. Robyn is an alumni of Wits University, so she's very much a Witsie. She did her honors degree in political studies at Wits. In fact, while also working at the same time at SABC, the South African Broadcasting Corporation. She has gone on to earn degrees from Cambridge. And of course, she also has a very rich history in that she was born in Perth, Australia, raised here in South Africa, and worked in Johannesburg, London, and Sydney, and various other places. She's currently based in Atlanta. And we couldn't therefore forget a better speaker. I could go on and on around her profile, but suffice it to say, we have a great speaker today, and we'll then therefore welcome her. If we're in a physical meeting, we'll give her a round of applause, but we can give her a virtual round of applause. Kindly feel free to post questions. Robyn will be able to respond to them. And most welcome. Over to you, Robyn.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bob. It's great being here and great speaking to you all. And thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Dr. Bob. I owe a lot to Wits and to the SABC and all my training on the ground there in Joburg all those years ago. So appreciate it. So hello, everybody. I'm speaking to you from suburban Atlanta in Georgia, which is in the deep South in America, the Bible Belt, which is out of all the gin joints in the world, it's a very odd place for the South African to find herself. But for now, this is home. I moved here 10 years ago when CNN called me over from Joburg to come and anchor a show. So it's been 7 weeks, 50 days or so since Donald Trump moved back into the White House and installed that big red Diet Coke button in the Oval Office. And I want to look at this time that we're living through right now with a wide perspective, with a compassionate perspective, and with my journalist's view of often sitting on the fence and being able to try and look things from a macro view. So the title of this talk is entitled Trump Unleashed. Thanks, Wits, I think, Larato. It's a really, really good title because I like the word unleashed to describe this president. It evokes both positive and negative, doesn't it? It's about creativity and chaos. Unleashed is a wild, feral animal, uncontained and unrestrained. Unleashed is also a leader unshackled and unshackling the cage around him. So unleashed can mean many different things to many different Americans, and it certainly can mean many different things to many of you folks who are outside of the States right now. And we're probably watching all of this with a combination of horror, amusement, or maybe even delight. I don't know. But as you know, and as Dr. Bob kind of referred to it, I mean, there's a whole industry now built up around Trump and this administration. The media, social media, memes, historians, academics, think tank analysts, podcasts, all of them trying to dissect what is happening. I like to call, though, this industry, sometimes I call it the angertainment industry. Media in America has changed, and it's built to make you scared. It's built to make you angry. It's built to make you fearful. So when you hear words like Nazis, oligarchy, waste, fraud, corruption, democracy, totalitarianism, war, Putin, Xi, Trump, authoritarianism, I mean, it just goes on. Elon, waste, Trump. I mean, there's end of the world analysis every minute of the day. And it really feels like you're being triggered because you are, deliberately so. And this constant barrage of fear and outrage is obviously infectious, and it's happening every day, every minute, rinse and repeat. And I think there is this constant sense of being flabbergasted. You know, the people who are flabbergasted by absolutely everything Trump does. It's like Pavlov's dog. Trump said it, Trump did it, we hate it. And then conversely, you've got the opposite, the people who are flabbergasted at any criticism of him. And, you know, they will defend his actions and defend him, whatever. They're flabbergasted by any criticism. Whatever Trump did, he's right. You know, and I think I would like to talk about the folks in the middle, the Americans in the middle, the people who are not on the extremes. There are a lot of Americans right now who take with some of what Trump says with a pinch of salt, some of what he does with a shrug of their shoulders. Some of them are not at all happy most of the time with what he does, but sometimes they're a little quietly optimistic about his plans. There are a lot of people here who voted for him. There are a lot of people who didn't vote for him, but didn't vote for the Democrats. And there are also a lot of people who didn't vote for him, but are waiting to see what happens. And then, of course, there's everybody else who's flabbergasted. And I think it's really important to know that there's a big disconnect between what you're hearing and listening and watching on the radio and the televisions and on your phones with what ordinary men on the street, women on the street here in America are thinking. And Dr. Bob mentioned this podcast that I started, and I started, it's called Searching for America, because it is an active search for trying to understand the heart and the soul of this country, and also why people wanted to vote for Trump in the first place. I started it just before the election, and I wanted to know what my neighbors, what my friends were thinking, and why many of them were actually going to vote for Trump. I was fascinated by that. Since then, I've interviewed a lot of teachers, spies, doctors, musicians, a lot of my old friends and journalists from CNN, and a lot of spies. I do like a good spy as a guest. But I think it's really important to note, particularly in times like this, when we're hearing a lot of flabbergasted extremes, that not every American is a gun-toting, red cap-wearing, make America great extremist with a glint of paternalism and a healthy obsession with junk food. I think it's really important to have a broad perspective, as I said. So I like to think of myself as having an inside-out looking perspective and an outside looking in view. That gives you a sense of where we're going. And what is clear is that we're in a time of massive social and technological change. We're in it. And I firmly believe that it's trying to understand these connecting tissues between problems and solutions, that you need a cool head and a broad view. Pragmatism is key here. If we're going to survive, if anybody's going to survive the next 4 years, you have to understand that Trump is here. He's in charge. So how do you manage this unleashing without constant hand-wringing fueled by this angertainment industry? Trump Unleashed is both a consequence and a reaction to what has come before, but it's also very focused on the future. And Dr. Bob there mentioned Trump 2.0. It's very different from from the first Trump presidency. And I think that's what I would like to focus on. So the way I'm going to break this up is I'm going to talk about the past, the present, and the future. How we got here, what's happening now, and what to expect. So let me also just tell you, with that in mind, a little bit more about where I live. Nearby, here in suburban Atlanta, there are 3 mega churches. Each church complex has a 6-story car park. On Sundays, there are traffic police needed to deal with the traffic coming in and out of church. At my daughter's high school, there are lockers, there are jocks, there are cheerleaders, there are baseball fields and football fields. There's also a diner nearby that looks like it's straight out of the 1950s or the movies Grease. Nearby too, there's also this fabulous place called Lassiter's. It's a dive bar, and it's modeled on the bar out of Cheers, that place where everyone knows your name. Now, my former neighbors, old school Southerners who are in their 80s, called Paul and Betty Ann, they like to go down to Lassiter's to the dive bar for a pretty affordable and quite chatty lunch a few times a week. It's the kind of place where you can order that great Southern delicacy, chicken wings with blue cheese sauce, and a burger with fries. Now, the waitress does know their name. She even likes and knows what they like to drink. Paul always orders a glass of wine, maybe more than one, and Betty Ann always orders a Crown Royal whiskey with Diet Coke. So I've gone to Lassiter's with them a few times, just because it's such a fascinating Southern and American experience. Paul and Betty Ann were telling me about the bar. So if you imagine the Cheers bar, it's kind of square. And they were saying to me, Robyn, on the right-hand side, those are all the MAGA folks. Those are the ones that are keen for Trump. And they go, look, on that side, those are the Democrats. You know, they love Biden and Kamala. And they point out this guy called Bob, who comes there every day for a chicken salad and a vodka tonic, and then goes home and watches reruns of cowboy shows. So I said to Paul and Betty Ann, well, what about the people in the middle? And Paul goes, well, then nobody's going to speak to you, Robyn. And we laughed, because those people in the middle are exactly the ones that I think we need to listen to more and we need to speak to more, because in many ways, they are the real Americans. And they are also the ones that voted for Trump. So why? Now, Georgia's a really interesting place because it's a swing state. It's a purple state, which means it's a blend of Republican red and Democrat blue. And Atlanta is a particularly also interesting state because it's blended, black and white, young and old, a lot of new young family transplants from the more expensive West Coast or Northeast. We've got these great old Southern families who live in these beautiful antebellum mansions, and they've gone to the same country clubs since their granddaddy was a little itty boy. This is a fascinating place because Martin Luther King preached down the road from me, and Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer here in Georgia before he became president. This is a place where country music extols the simplicity of God and the South. On my local country music station, which is called the Bull FM, there are songs about girls and trucks and beer, of fishing at the lake, of driving on dirt roads. Jesus is everywhere. In fact, there's so many songs about drinking a beer with Jesus or fishing with Jesus that there are just as many songs about that as breakup songs with girls or hunting with the guys. This is also a place where the African American churches wield enormous power and political influence here, underpinning most of the Democratic support in the South. The legacy of slavery and the Civil War is very acute. In fact, my house is built on a Confederate battle site. The past is both here and very far away. I live on the banks of the Chattahoochee River. Chattahoochee is an old Cherokee name from the local Native American tribes that used to live here too. There's a lot of money. Never seen so much money in my life. But there's also a lot of guns. And there are a lot of good people with both or neither. So how do I fathom this place? Particularly because I became an American citizen last year. My daughters, who are now 18 and 15, are Americans. They speak with a bit of a Southern twang. We moved here 10 years ago, and we've tried to understand this place, that it sometimes felt like we moved to the moon. And I think it's been a journey, which is why I called that podcast Searching for America. When I moved here, I was obviously in the belly of the beast, anchoring a show on CNN, and it was chaotic. And I thought, I don't think I can do this again. But what is interesting is that when Biden came in, it seemed like sanity had been restored, that the Trump chaos theory of leadership had been this sort of momentary blip, an aberration, a little wrinkle in this time-space continuum. I resigned from CNN soon after the Afghanistan withdrawal, which was chaotic, deadly, and weirdly incompetent. And looking back now, that Afghanistan withdrawal sometimes seems like a little bit of a symbol of the Biden administration, because it didn't feel like the Biden administration was in charge of anything at time. And I say the Biden administration rather than the Biden presidency, acutely aware that I think more and more information is going to come out that Joe Biden was far more incapacitated than we knew, and that a lot of decisions over the Biden presidency were made by staff, or perhaps by aides, or lobby groups, even his wife. So it's very important to hold that in the back of your mind. So the Biden administration it reminded me, or the last 4 years, reminded me a little about that adage of when you go bankrupt, which is you go bankrupt slowly and then all at once. Well, America started to get very political slowly and then all at once. And the politics of victimhood that we had seen Trump so acutely master during the Trump years and during that first election. Trump had been, as I said, a master of the rhetoric of us versus them. What became fascinating and so surprising in many ways was that the Biden administration became a master at codifying us and them differences. So the Biden administration, during this time, America's culture war suddenly became elephants in every classroom, every college campus, every workplace. Americans started to feel like dogma and orthodoxy were everywhere. Americans started to feel that, and particularly the ones in the middle, started to feel that the liberal establishment had become illiberal. You had to put pronouns in your emails, microaggressions were policed, jobs and contracts were lost or kept depending on how you identified or what you looked like. You had to check your privilege and your patriarchy. Biological men were allowed to participate in girls' sports. All of this started mattering to the middle of America. And it was during this time that I traveled a lot with my now 15-year-old daughter, who's a keen sportswoman. She plays lacrosse, out of all things, which is a combination of hockey and soccer. But I was traveling with her club team around Georgia and around America. And several times a week at games and at practices, I would be spending time sitting next to the parents of this team. Now, the team was based an hour north of where we are. So up in North Georgia, which is, to be fair, probably called redneck country, rural America, Republican towns. These were rural parts of Georgia, small towns kept alive by a few factories. The parents I sat with were not the worldly liberals that I'd hung out with at CNN, nor were they some of the patrician, wealthy, old school Reagan Republicans that I sometimes played tennis with, nor were they the screaming kind of super right-wing MAGA nut jobs that I'd seen on Fox News. These people that I was sitting with out in North Georgia and in these rural parts of America watching team sports were teachers at public schools. A lot of them owned their own businesses, providing pipes, air conditioning services to their small towns. They were salesmen. They probably didn't have passports. They took a vacation, if they could, to Florida or to Alabama. As my dad would say, they were salt of the earth. And also importantly, because kids' sports only really starts in high school, all kids' sports before high school is volunteer-based at churches and in clubs. So these dads and moms were also coaching their girls' teams. And so I got to know them. And they were also struggling with grocery costs, petrol costs, gas costs here. Their microcosm started getting impacted in ways that they had not really figured out. So this is one of the reasons they voted for Trump. They did two things, and they voted for Trump for two reasons. The Dems, they felt, focused more on woke than broke. They went for identity politics rather than the economy. Here's a text message from the coach of that team, the girl dad, who I think is the kind of man who would stop on the side of the highway in the rain to help you fix a tire. He's that kind of a good human. And he said, this is around the election time, most people don't care if you're black, white, brown, red, green, gay, straight, transgendered, or if you think you're a hippopotamus, as long as you don't mess with people's microcosm. He said Trump is an a-hole, but he's America's a-hole. And so that's why so many middle Americans, good Americans, voted for a man that even they are calling an a-hole. Another man, a comedian who was one of the first employees at Facebook and now works as a comedian, spoke to me on my podcast. He's going to be up in the next few weeks. And he also said, you know, I just think that Trump is an unreasonable person. But unreasonable people get stuff done. And so this is why Trump's victory was fascinating. So I'm trying to get you to understand why he is where he is. The very people, the minorities, the so-called victims of the politics of victimization that the Democrats said they were protecting with identity politics, actually landed up voting for Trump. Across the board, Trump's victory in November was as wide and as deep across society as it ever has been. I mean, it's quite astounding when you look at the graphs and you look at the percentage of Black men, Latinos, Latinas, women, the rich, the poor, urban, rural, even Native Americans. Trump expanded his popularity across the board, almost across the country. Everybody, every demographic moved slightly right. They were worried about their microcosm, but they also felt that they could trust him with what needed to be done. And this is so key. So when you're outside and you're wondering, well, there's this crazy guy, he's power hungry, he's unleashed, just remember that he has a huge amount of popularity and he has a mandate from the American people because they know exactly what they signed up for, because he told them what he would do. And that is really important. So again, here we have it. We have an unreasonable man unleashed by reasonable people, which brings me to now, to the present. So Trump got here because he said he would focus on those who were woke and not those who, that he would focus on those who were broke, not woke. So if you also try to fathom and break through this entertainment industry by seeing his actions through that prism, everything that he's doing is about broke, not woke. Now, it's not just those ordinary Americans that I've told you about, that I sat with next to the sports field, who are broke, who are struggling with high prices and worrying about their future. The country is broke too. I want to give you some key points. The USA is $37 trillion in debt. 30% of that needs to be financed in the next 12 months. There's a $2 trillion deficit. And interestingly, 30% of the economy is dependent on some sort of government spending. So here's another number. In the last 5 years, there's been a 2% population increase and a 53% increase in spending. So for a nation built on capitalist mythology, this is a real problem. America is essentially in a debt spiral. 4% of GDP is going to be spent on trying to manage the deficit in the coming years. So the main reason Donald Trump is back in charge is because of those numbers, because a budget needs to be balanced. This is not a secret. Government has been overspending, overpromising. Congress has been writing checks too. But this has been supercharged in the last few years. So as you know, Trump has come up with a plan, and it's Doge, tariffs, taxes. That's his plan. So let me break that down. And this is the real estate guy. Don't forget, this is the New York real estate guy who has negotiated with the mob and construction guys. He's a gambler by nature. He started casinos. He likes to use gambling analogies. Who has the right cards? Is this a gamble? Economists might say yes, but this is his plan. 1, he needs to lower federal and government spending, that 30%. How's he doing it? Elon Musk, Doge. Cut jobs and programs that fuel and sustain that 30%. That's the chainsaw economics. Cut, 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 see what's left. Rebuild and resurrect afterwards. What matters? As one business leader told me, break all the eggs, make an omelette with what's left. So then, how do you create growth and jobs when you've just cut a chunk of jobs and projects in the public sector? Lower taxes is his logic, to give those folks a softer landing and to encourage the private sector to step in. Now the controversial thing of tariffs. Backfill all of these losses by taxing something else, or better yet, tax consumption. So that's where the tariffs come in. Tariffs, in Trump's view, bring production back to America, which creates more private sector jobs. And there's a reason he's calling these tariffs external taxation. Now, I know some of you who are economists out there, whether you're on the left or the right, or whether you've studied this or not, are having a field day. They say this is daft, hocus pocus mathematics. It's never worked. Doesn't even make sense. Who the hell's doing all of these sums? And again, also, even if you're not an economist, you're flabbergasted. Flabbergasted in Mexico, flabbergasted in Canada, flabbergasted in South Africa, Europe. What's he doing to us? All very fair questions. It's not just the chainsaw economics, but it's combined with this wrecking ball politics. But I just want to remind you what the end game is here, what the focus is, what the laser focus is from Washington, from Trump's Washington. It's slowing or stopping America's debt spiral. That's the lens. So if the world and multilateralism is going to be remade in the process as well, the feeling in Trump's team is, well, again, break eggs, make omelet later. In my podcast titled, Duh, Why Trump Won, it's the first one I did after the election, I likened him to a plumber. That if you have a blocked toilet, you're going to want to hire someone else to stick their hand down and unblock the toilet. Well, Trump is America's plumber. Nobody else here wants to do this. They've hired him to do it. So when Musk and Trump and co says America is going to stop paying for stuff, it's not because they hate AIDS babies or transgender opera singers in Ireland or LGBTQ in Myanmar. It's because they want to pull America out of a debt spiral. That's all there is to it. Reduce federal spend, reduce taxation, increase tariffs to create a net buffer. So if you have a trade deficit with America, beware. Trump's coming after you like Cyril looking for hard cash in his sofa. That's the plan. Will it work? I don't know. I'm not here to say whether it works or defend him or to criticize it, but I just want to give you the perspective to help you understand what appears to be chaos is actually this very lasered 3-point plan. Brings me to the future. Where the hell is all of this going? And again, I don't have a crystal ball, but I can certainly see some trends that are happening here and I've been hearing about from folks and sources in Washington. Trump will be in his early 80s at the end of his presidency. J.D. Vance was chosen as the vice president for a reason. He's likely to be the next president, J.D. Vance, probably with 2 terms. I've yet to meet an American, even a Democrat, who's appalled by everything that's going on, who admits to themselves that they think the Democrats can pull themselves to the center. The Democrats are a broad church of liberals, and the super left progressives who seem to have the conversation within the party at the moment, still seem, out of touch with average Americans. And that's what I'm trying to get to you, is that they're saying things like men can get pregnant and that Trump is a Nazi. Unless a common sense doer comes out of the Democrats with a plan to fix the debt, the deficit, and add jobs, rather than an ideologue, I don't think you're going to see a Democrat in power for a while, which is why you're then likely to see Trump, Vance for the next 3.5, 4 years, then Vance and possibly Trump Jr. as vice president for the next 8 years. People in Washington are already calling J.D. Vance 48 for the 48th president. So this is really important also when you're looking at their big plan here. Vance is also part of a new group of players inside the Oval Office and across the government. He's part of the tech bros. The first administration was very focused on the Mike Pence Christian base. This time it's different. And it's an odd mixture because it's a source of tension within the Trump administration. And this is also something else fascinating. This push and pull between those core red hat MAGA diehards who are Christians, who are isolationists, and they're angry, versus these tech bros. I mean, I can list them. You know some of them. J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, David Sachs, Mark Andreessen, Peter Thiel. There are a whole bunch of them. These are libertarian, Silicon Valley tech geeks or venture capitalists who do not subscribe to any God or ideology other than those first principles of San Francisco entrepreneurs. They're on board along with the leaders of the who's who of some of the greatest companies in America in the last 20, 30 years. They are all backing a president now that they did not back in 2016, who they considered toxic in 2016. So what changed? Why do you have the tech bros coming on the back of this presidency like oxpeckers on a rhino, essentially? Well, it's China. It's China. In the last few years, there's been a stomach-churning realization by many in America that China is not just a competitor, but an adversary. And it's been a really hard reality check that China is not just an economic threat to American hegemony and dominance. It's a national security threat. And this is where this overlaps with the debt crisis. China has a massive trade deficit with America. It's outplayed America, I would say, on strategy and tactics by all means possible. Quietly, of course, as many of you know, stealing, copying intellectual property of American companies, knocking off, bettering, outplaying on product design on everything from armaments to drones to EVs. Also, this is critical. This is so critical. China has control of supply chains, the most important supply chains, not just the medical stuff like the masks and the IV drips we saw during COVID, but the same goes for almost the whole green economy. Electric vehicles, solar panels, wind turbines, all made in China. Basic ingredients of the tech economy, the building blocks of computers, microchips, cell phones, AI, the rare earth metals like nickel, etc., all controlled by China. So perhaps now you understand why there's this push to own Greenland. So yes, this is a realization, and this is factoring heavily into this push and where we're going. So yes, I know it's a scary world in the post-19, and it does seem like the post-1945 order is crumbling, fragmenting, like so much else in the world. Fragmentation, I think, is the key word. Trump and his wrecking ball diplomacy might speed it up, yes, but the threads were already fraying before Trump and before this Trump presidency. And that's because China, Russia, and Iran have not been playing by the rules, these post-45 rules. The West has been over-regulating and over-policing itself, says the Trump team. Meanwhile, China and Russia have been playing a different game. Russia invaded Ukraine against every international norm when it comes down to sovereignty. China's actions, as I've mentioned, in stealing IPs break every WTO rule. Iran, China, and Russia's human rights abuses towards minorities, towards opposition, is against the very essence of the United Nations charters they've all signed up to. So Trump and the tech bros and the American voters know that if America is to survive and critically thrive in the next 100 years or so, it needs to ensure the supremacy of the US dollar, energy, and innovation. So to beat China and to pull itself out of this debt spiral, America needs the tech bros and a dose of Trumpism. That is the thinking of American voters. There's a lot of ground to catch up, a lot of urgency, as you can see. I mean, it's just crazy. The flood the zone stuff. Trump and his team are working because they know they have limited time. It's not just about the ground that's been lost, but it's also midterms that are coming up. So expect this pace and this sense of urgency and chaos to continue. I want to give you a sense of just how people in Washington are understanding the Chinese threat and how America is so ill prepared for it. Every single ship, boat, and floating lilo manufactured in China is required by law to have a reinforced bottom so that it allows that ship, that boat, that floating lilo to be commandeered to transport military vehicles. So the Chinese Navy is not just the Chinese Navy. It's every single dinghy or cruise liner that can sail. So when you look at what DOGE is doing in the DoD, which is the Department of Defense, it's about trying to repurpose a nearly $1 trillion budget to be ready to fight a digital war in lower orbit or in the deep sea, and to ensure AI and the energy needed to produce these large learning machines is there. And I know, I get it. Trump turns off many people, including those who voted for him. They don't like his hair. They don't like the tone of his voice. They don't like his erratic nature. They hate his capacity for pettiness. They don't trust him sometimes. But it's so interesting that he's there because the Democrats lost the center. They overreached too left. Yes, there is a huge fear that Trump and his team and the worst instincts of his MAGA dudes will overreach too much on the right, which is where you're getting a lot of this anxiety. But for now, when I sit with these folks at the Lassiter bar and at the parents on the sides of the sports fields, they are giving Trump and his team time, and they're giving him a long leash, okay? And I tend to advise people to do that too. There's one analyst who's not a Trump supporter, but is supportive of the broad government. And he says he has a 72-hour rule, that Trump says something and he waits 72 hours to see what actually really mattered, what came out of the bluster. I believe you should wait a little longer. Trump says something or does something, just give it a few weeks. See where that's going. I suggest you perhaps join Paul and Betty Ann and pour yourself a bourbon, a Kentucky bourbon, and watch and wait. I know this is a time of change. I know Trump is perhaps the worst messenger, but for Americans, this is about, like I said, it's about the national debt and the deficit and pulling America out of a debt spiral. Everything he's doing is seen through that lens. It's about national security and it's about the future. It's about an unreasonable man potentially getting unreasonable things done. It's going to be messy. The markets are going to go all over the place. Potentially going to be unfair and unpleasant. But from Trump's point of view, he's been hired as a plumber and he's got a job to do. So I hope that helped. I know there's a lot of questions here, and I'm going to just move over and just answer some. Let's have a look. And I'm assuming somewhere, and I specifically didn't speak about South Africa, but I'm assuming there probably, hopefully, something in here on South Africa. There's a question from Irene about Canada. How does Canada fit into this agenda? Canada seems to think Trump is serious about being a 51st state. I think it's the same conversation about Greenland. A lot of the stuff he says, and it is very much a New York bargaining tool. He'll overstate, and then he sets it up, and then people come reeling in, and there's a compromise. I think with Mexico and Canada, the neighbors, again, you've got to look at it through this lens of debt and trying to make US companies healthier. Will that work out in the long term? I don't know. There is this push and pull. A lot of these tech bros, they're more free marketers than the sort of Steve Bannon types who are certainly more isolationist. So you're already seeing a lot of these tariffs conversations being negotiation techniques, and also foreign policy tools, as carrots and sticks. Again, I think it's worth not being too flabbergasted by it, but at the same time, just waiting and seeing how this pans out. What is interesting, for an example on this, is Panama. Do you remember there was, in those first few days, he was going on about taking over the Panama Canal, and in the last week or so, that conversation pushed the Hong Kong-based ports authorities who owned those ports at the other end of the Panama Canal, which was his problem. He said, we're paying China to transport cargo through the Panama Canal. Well, that's just been sold to BlackRock, an American firm. So already you've seen a very interesting solution to the Panama issue that has nothing to do with America kind of seizing or invading Panama. That deal's been done. So a lot of this is bluster. It's a negotiating, bargaining technique. Some of it, yes, is scary, but it's interesting how this is going to play out. And I'll have another note on that because I'm hoping there's going to be another question on here. Let me see. Gaza, and maybe that goes to Gaza. Thanks to Wendy for that. And I know that's an interesting one for South Africans. But again, you're not going to see Gaza Lago. You know, that whole thing about building golf courses in Gaza. Really, don't take him literally on a lot of this stuff. I think not many Americans do. What he has done with throwing out that extremely absurd suggestion that America will, you know, build casinos in Gaza and be it. What it's done is that it has jilted the conversation. He's trying to get Arab partners, other folks in the neighborhood, as well as Israel, to come up with their own plan. And already we're seeing today these conversations about, you know, with Marco Rubio, having conversations about rebuilding Gaza, that I don't think the Israelis are even involved in, interestingly. So a lot of this stuff can seem cray-cray, but he's pushing things in a way that is clumsy, it's messy, it's disconcerting, it leaves you flabbergasted. But the conversations are changing on that. It's quite interesting. And on the issue of Israel, you know, the Israeli media, I was reading, I think, the Times of Israel yesterday. The Israeli media is pointing out the fact that, you know, if Trump has turned on Mexico and Canada and Denmark, for example, you know, there's no guarantee that Bibi Netanyahu and Israel are going to get blanket support or a blank check from him. And I think that's acutely being held as well. So, you know, yes, the world is feeling very unsettled, but there might be some interesting conversations or solutions out of this down the line. I am being hopeful, I am being optimistic, and I am trying to take a broader view. I know. And I'm trying not to be flabbergasted by every tweet, because I don't think that's helpful. I think if you look at it through the lens, like I said, of trade as a method to bump up, to pull America out of a debt spiral, I think you can probably see where he's coming on a lot of that stuff. What else? I'm sorry, I'm trying to... So yes, and I'm again, let's talk about South Africa. I know that Jan has talked about, just mentioned it. There are a few of you who I know are going to be concerned about this executive order, this very early executive order that I think surprised everybody regarding South Africa. I read through that, and then I read through some of the US Embassy responses to it, which clarified it slightly in the days and weeks afterwards. I'm not there in Joburg, you know, and so I'm not completely covering the minutiae of the South African backwards and forwards on this. But again, I would point out to you that yes, the the whole conversation around Afrikaans farmers and refugee status and all of that, I feel like it's a little bit of that. We all know we can have a conversation about whether, just where that information is coming from and whether it's acutely true. I think the key with this is Iran and China. And I think it's about South Africa's shift towards Russia, China, and Iran. And I think it is a very simple equation if you look at it through this prism of what I've been talking about. The US gives X amount of money or opens certain markets through AGOA, for example. If South Africa is taking the money and then not working or not collaborating in the strategic interests of America, if essentially America sees South Africa as a bad friend, and to quote another South African, finish and klaar. I mean, it's a simple decision. Then we don't give you money. If you don't want to align with us, don't take our money. What can South Africa and Cyril and the team do? I think the wrong thing to do would be to become super ideological, start accusing America of genocide, which is unfortunately what we've seen Cyril do by writing an article recently. Suddenly taking a very kind of hardline, obstinate position on issues that, yes, might align with South Africa's foreign policy, but there's also South Africa's national interests. And does South Africa want to deal with America? Does Cyril want to put ideology over national interests? Can a compromise be talked about? Can AGOA be saved? Can some of these other projects be not cut? If the South Africans say, well, listen, we're going to tone down our rhetoric on this. We're going to pull out of the ICJ court case, where there just has to be some sort of compromise, I think, with someone like Trump. Zelensky made the same mistake. I mean, according to much of right-wing media, here, he got a phone call an hour before that Oval Office meeting, and he was told, go in hard with Trump. And the one thing about Trump, which, you don't have to be a psychologist and you certainly don't have to be an intelligence officer profiling foreign leaders to know that he's a very particular kind of character. We know a man like Trump. He reminds us of uncles sitting at Christmas tables half the time. He's a certain generation of man. He's probably a narcissist. And he's in charge of America. And I think being lectured to on publicly, being shamed, is not a very conducive way to get him to make a deal. And if you're trying to get something out of him, then you need to come and say, hey, I'm thinking of compromising on this. Would you mind compromising on that? It's not something you want to do, but if you're the leader of a country like South Africa, not great growth, a lot of problems. If you want to alienate America, the quickest and easiest way to do it is to sneer or make jokes at the president. And the consequences might be some sort of ideological sneering from the South Africans, but not very practical for the national security, the national interests of South Africa's interests, I think. I think it's going to be interesting. If any of you are more interested in that, it's worth listening to Peter Bruce's conversation actually with Joel Pollak, who might be the next US ambassador. And Peter Bruce and Joel had a very interesting conversation about what might come out of that. That's a very specific one. What else? Somebody said, didn't you say you're from Alaska? No, I'm from Atlanta in the South. What else can we do? Thanks to I think, I think this conversation about alienating allies is a really important one. You know, someone here is saying, is it worth alienating all of the US's former allies irreversibly, or does he simply not care? And that's a very good question, because when I talk about the breakdown of the post-1945 world, I mean, this is about alliances. It's about building neighborhoods of friends who you can rely on. So if Trump breaks down those alliances, that's where the fear is that these bilateral, transactional, great power rivalry kind of politics take precedence. And it is a dangerous conversation. But as I argued earlier, I think it was already happening. Yes, we might be overstating or understating just how powerful China is. But Trump's view of what he sees as Europeans, for example, where there's a big trade deficit, at the same time, Europeans asking for kind of blanket American security guarantees, he sees it through that prism of fixing America's debt spiral. It's a zero-sum game for him. He's like, well, we're giving you all this money. We can't afford to give you all of this money. What do we get back? How this plays out in the long term, does this reinforce alliances? Does it break them down completely? Does this rebuild some really strong bilateral, trilateral groupings? This is all happening right now. And I think it's worth looking at why this is happening and not being, particularly if you're on the edge of this. If this is being done to you, it's worth looking at it from the prism of Trump and his personality and why he's doing it. And then I think coming up with a game plan that is strategic rather than knee-jerk flabbergastedness. Yeah. What else? Common ground, Andrew. I think the common ground is there common ground between the USA and RSA, or is it broken beyond repair? I think there's a lot to be fixed. But again, I think you've got to go there. Cyril has got to be able to go with a deal. He's got to make a deal. And you don't make a deal with somebody by publicly calling them out beforehand and chastising them. You know, and again, it's very, I mean, I remember all those years I spent reporting in Southern Africa in particular, and all of you know this, you know, if you go to a big induna and you want to get something, I want to film, or I want to get some information, or I want to, hang out in some tribal area in South Africa, whether it's in Venda in the, in the north, or whether it was in KwaZulu-Natal or in the Transkei, I had these conversations with chiefs, which is what I think, Trump is a lot like, an old school chief. And you'd sit with the induna, you'd come in, you'd be respectful, you'd ask how the family's doing, how his health is, you'd maybe explain a little bit about yourself, you'd say, oh, I'm here in respect, maybe you've brought, I don't know, something with you. If you're trying to do a deal or have a conversation with a big chief, an induna, you brought a bottle of whiskey, I don't know, okay, some whatever. And I think it's a little bit like that, those very old-fashioned rules of engagement. Okay, Mr. Trump, what can we do for you? And I think bargaining power. So that's the tone of how I think South Africa or anyone needs to be dealing with this administration. There needs to be a conversation rather than a lecturing to them. What does South Africa have? South Africa, as we know, has some great mineral opportunities. South Africa has shifted too much criticism towards Iran, China, and potential also. I don't think you quite understand how appalled Americans were by South Africa's support for Hamas. There are more Jews in America than in Israel. 80% of Americans support Israel, and 80% of Americans do not agree that negotiating or supporting blanket outright terrorism and October the 7th and Hamas is in any way indicative of a foreign policy or a friend that they would like to do business with. So while the South Africans and Cyril might get a lot of political popularity and support for that line, the Americans, it's the one bit of news that broke through from South Africa in the last year, was about South Africa's support for Hamas, and particularly terrorism. And that did not go down well. So I think there has to be some sort of humility involved in what the Americans need and want, and what South Africa needs and wants. South Africa likes to say it's a bridge. That, you know, we still consider ourselves exceptional, and that might or might not be true. But if South Africa and Cyril are positioning themselves as, you know, BRICS, you know, voice of the South, all of that, you know, and Trump wants to be doing deals, peace agreements, trade deals with China, with Iran even, maybe even with Hamas. Look, they were talking to Hamas without the Israelis knowing. If Trump wants to be doing that stuff, because he doesn't want a war, make that very clear. This man does not want war. Wouldn't it be great if Cyril and South Africa offered themselves as a negotiator between the two, interlocutor? You know, I think South Africa has a lot of options in terms of how to play America and be useful to America. But it has to be done with old school kind of realpolitik incentives, definitely. I know there's somebody here, and these are very good questions too. You know, there may be parallels between Trump's rise and actions. How does the US avoid a totalitarian government becoming entrenched? I've been seeing this a lot. How much have we got? We've got 5 minutes. I might have to. Lorata will interrupt me when I'm done. But I think looking at this time in history right now through the prism of previous moments in history isn't helpful. So, you know, a lot of people saying, oh, well, you know, this is 1938, this is appeasement with Russia. I don't know. Is it 1939? Is this the rise of the Nazi Party? Then, you know, then we're having, you know, Chile, 1970s. I think you've got to understand that we're in this sort of third industrial revolution. In times of change, there is a lot going on. And at the moment, I think we have to come up with our own words and our own sense of what's happening right now, without trying to sort of force a square peg into a round hole, into some sort of previous historical analogy. Yes, history can be instructive, and it certainly is a warning, particularly because we saw the rise of Nazism come out of a very democratic, sophisticated society like Germany. But it's very different. The rise of the Nazis is a very particular historical quirk, based on a very particular historical time. And the other thing I really want to stress, particularly as somebody who obviously was there covering, you know, the damage done by Jacob Zuma to our democracy. I was there for years covering Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. And it is very interesting in how strong the checks and balances are in America, even though Trump has both the House and the Senate. You know, each of the 50 states here have very developed local systems of government. The federal interweaving of things is it's a very strong system. And Americans are very attached to the mythology of their democracy and their capitalism. And I think that this tension that we're seeing now, you know, is there. But I've particularly because I've covered other failed democracies, or seen democracy really being tested by malignant forces, such as some of Zuma and the Gupta's cadres. You know, I do think America can weather this in ways that you don't have to be shouting, this is the death of democracy. I think the institutions are extremely strong here. And that is really important, because he does need to push back. And there's all this stuff with his executive orders, Doge, the kind of heavy-handedness, cruelty, I think somebody said. Absolutely. All of this is already being challenged in the courts. All of this will be challenged with appropriations committees in Congress. This seems like it's this willy-nilly kind of, you know, almost Marvel-like chaos agent thing. It is all going to be tested by and the media here, obviously, which is extremely strong and loud and powerful. So yes, I know that this is a time of tension, and there are certainly warning signs, as I said, about those worst instincts of the Trump team. But I really do trust the institutions within America to weather this tension in a way that I think is really important. And ordinary Americans won't let it get, I don't think, to a place where they feel like they're sitting in a totalitarian regime. I wouldn't go there just yet. Yep. Julia's talking about discounting Trump's interest in accumulating wealth for himself. I mean, that meme coin the day before he became president, I mean, that's really unhelpful. Just really kind of ridiculous. And that's also one of the things that many Americans just found utterly distasteful. Yes, but they still voted for him. They know that. And that's the key, I think. They voted for him, knowing that. Putin and the treatment of Ukraine, also interesting with Ukraine. Just before I go, I know Lorata might pop me up a little bit. Ukraine is an interesting one, and it's certainly a moving target at the moment on all levels. Some criticism that Trump is using a carrot on Putin and a stick on Zelensky. Either way, there needs to be a deal done in Ukraine. If Biden or Kamala Harris, had won, they would also be pushing for some sort of deal. The war has to end. And again, there has to be some compromises, and it's all kind of messy, and it is distasteful. And I'm not quite sure how this is going to pan out. But again, Trump needs there to be some sort of solution to that. And the same would have happened if Biden or Kamala were in power. That the war, Ukraine is not winning. Too many people are dying. It's draining funds. And that continued instability in Europe there needs to be a resolution. And what he says he's doing is he's trying to get both parties to the table, both parties to compromise. Again, let's see how that plays out. It's fascinating times.
Thank you so much, Robyn. Hello, everyone. My name is Lerato Mtambanengwe. I am the Alumni Relations Officer at Wits. And I'd just like to thank Robyn for this webinar. She woke up bright and early to be with us today. Thank you for taking the time out for us. Thank you so much for unpacking and, clarifying a lot of the questions and issues that, there's been question marks all over the place for everybody, I think. So I'm confident that everyone has taken something out of your insightful talk today as we all brace ourselves for what's to come. If you haven't done so yet, please remember to sign up for Robyn's newsletter and podcast. It's called Searching for America. It is definitely well worth it. I'd also like to thank Dr. Bob Wekesa. He's the director of the African Center for the Study of the United States. He did our introductory comments. Thank you very much, Doc. Please also follow the center on LinkedIn. They've got a lot of upcoming events. Tomorrow, they've got one where they'll be hosting a webinar titled Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Smart Cities in Africa. So do sign up for that webinar. And last but not least, a very special thank you to the over 360 attendees who joined us today from all over the world. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And yes, thank you. Any questions that we haven't been able to get to, Robyn, I will shoot them over to you, and hopefully we'll be able to get your views on those questions. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Robyn, take care. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.